One of the most shocking moments in English history was when King Charles I on the 30th of January 1649 was led to the executioner's scaffold. He was greeted by an anonymous axeman who would in one swift swing of his axe take the head off the king. Charles I was the king who lost the English Civil War, and he caused the deadliest conflict that ever broke out on English soil, and he was a very bad monarch. His death warrant was signed by many men, including Oliver Cromwell, and his trial was seen by many as a sham. But after the execution, there was a huge debate as to what to do with the remains of Charles and the man who had brought civil war to England yet again. But Parliament were concerned that Charles would be seen as a martyr and that his body would be recovered and venerated as a relic, but Charles would be buried in a place which was considered secret, and it would be lost to time for centuries, but then his coffin would be broken into and opened 200 years, after the axeman did his work. Join us today as we look at breaking into the coffin of King Charles I, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. King Charles I's execution was a momentous day, and on the day of his execution he was escorted under armed guard from St James's Palace, where he stayed, to the Palace of Whitehall. That evening, carpenters had been busy at work creating an execution scaffold for the crowds to see the proceedings, and this was set up outside a window of the Banqueting House. This was so big that everyone had a good view from around, and thousands would gather to witness the king losing his head. Charles was led out through a window, and he made a speech which was difficult to hear due to the commotion. He would state that an unjust sentence that I suffered to take effect is punished now by an unjust sentence on me, but I must tell you that their liberty and freedom consists in having government. It is not their having a share in their government. That is nothing appertaining unto them. A subject and a sovereign are clear different things. Before finishing, I shall go from a corruptible to an uncorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be. His words were ominous, and were those of a man who believed his time on earth was up, but Charles would then give himself over to the executioner at around 2 p.m. He lowered himself onto the executioner's block after saying a prayer, and he signalled to the executioner that he was ready. In one hard blow from the axe, the king's head was taken off, and the crowd that day, it's believed, sighed very loudly, as they were mixed in their feelings about the king's execution. Some rushed to the scaffold to dip their handkerchiefs in the king's blood, but the executioner skipped a number of parts, as he did not show the head to the crowd to avoid being identified, and then following this, the remains of the king were collected in a coffin. They were then taken back inside the palace, ready to be prepared for burial. It's believed that the head was then placed back on the body, as a doctor and physician would use thread to tie this back on, and the remains of Charles I were then also embalmed. Following this, his body was then placed inside of a lead-lined coffin ready to be buried, but there was a pause in proceedings, as there was a significant worry as to where the king would be buried. The commission established by Parliament to deal with the king's execution and death believed it was too risky for the king to be buried in the middle of central London, and in particular within the confines of Westminster Abbey. Parliament were terrified by retribution following the king's death, and they were worried about royalists rising up to fight back with a purpose and a cause. They were concerned that his burial place would have become a shrine also, and that people would try to dig his remains up. But because of this, the commission then looked for other suitable places to bury a king, and they settled upon Windsor Castle, and in particular St George's Chapel inside of the castle's walls, and this was believed to have been much quieter. Of course, in recent times, Queen Elizabeth II was buried inside of this chapel, and many other kings and queens of England have been laid to rest inside of the royal vault, along with other members of the royal family. But Parliament made the decision to bury the king rather quickly and quietly, and under the cover of darkness. Charles's coffin was taken during the night on the 9th of February 1649, and it was taken on a short journey from central London to Windsor. Moving the king's remains was kept quiet, and it did not attract a huge amount of scandal and controversy. The place specifically where Charles was buried was in the same vault as the notorious Tudor monarch King Henry VIII and his third wife Jane Seymour. This was found in the choir and under the floor, and this was considered a rather secret place. But Charles II, Charles I's son, would dream of building his father a huge mausoleum, but still today under the floor of the chapel, Charles is laid to rest. The burial was seen by a number of the king's former servants, but 200 years after the execution of the king, The coffin of King Charles I would be opened, and it was believed it had been lost to time, but it was found. During 1813 there was building work being carried out inside of the chapel, and because of this builders accidentally broke into the vault, containing the remains of Charles I, Jane Seymour and King Henry VIII, as well as a child of Queen Anne. They noticed that Henry's coffin was broken up and in a bad way, but then the coffin of Charles I was located as it had markings on top of it. It was then decided that the coffin would be opened up, and this was done on the 1st of April 1813 in front of the Prince Regent, the future King George IV. The man who opened the coffin was Sir Henry Halford, and he examined the body of Charles I and broke into the coffin. He saw the king's head and made an image of it, and when he removed the coffin lid, he came across a plain lead coffin with an inscription on it saying King Charles, 1648. He then made an opening in the top part of the coffin lid, and the internal wooden coffin was in a bad state, and the body of Charles I had been prepared in many different ways. It had been wrapped in many layers of cerecloth, and this was prepared with resin, which would preserve the body well. The body was so well wrapped that it was difficult for Halford to take the body out of the coffin and try to unwrap it. It was said of the king's remains that, at length, the whole face was disengaged from its covering. The complexion of the skin of it was dark and discoloured. The forehead and temples had lost little or nothing of their muscular substance. The cartilage of nose was gone, but the left eye in the first moment of exposure was open and full, though it vanished almost immediately, and the pointed beard so characteristic of the period of the reign of King Charles was perfect. The shape of the face was a long oval, many of the teeth remained, and the left ear, in consequence of the interposition of the unctuous matter between it and the cerecloth, was found entire. It was difficult at this moment to withhold a declaration that, notwithstanding its disfigurement, the countenance did bear a strong resemblance to the coins, the busts, and especially the pictures of King Charles I by Van Dyck, by which it had been familiar to us. It is true that the minds of the spectators of this interesting sight were well prepared to receive this impression, but it's almost certain that the facility of belief had been occasioned by the simplicity and truth of Mr. Herbert's narrative, every part of which had been confirmed by the investigation so far as it had advanced, and it will not be denied that the shape of the face, the forehead and eye, and the beard are the most important features by which resemblance is determined. When the head had been entirely disengaged from the attachments which confined it, it was found to be loose, and without any difficulty was taken up and held to view. It was quite wet, and gave a greenish-red tinge to paper, and to linen which touched it. The back part of the scalp was entirely perfect, and had a remarkably fresh appearance, the pores of the skin being more distinct, as they usually are when soaked in moisture, and the tendons and ligaments of the neck were of considerable substance and firmness. The hair was thick at the back part of the head, and in appearance nearly black. A portion of it, which has since been cleaned and dried, is of a beautiful dark brown colour. That of the beard was a redder brown. On the back part of his head was more of an inch of length, and had probably been cut so short for the convenience of the executioner, or perhaps by the piety of friends soon after death, in order to furnish memorials of the unhappy king. At some point Halford even held the head up and analysed it, confirming that this was in fact King Charles I without any doubt. He said of this that the muscles of the neck had evidently retracted themselves considerably, and the fourth cervical vertebrae was found to be cut through its substance transversely, leaving the surfaces of the divided portions perfectly smooth, and even an appearance which could only be produced by a heavy blow, inflicted with a very sharp instrument. This confirmed that Charles I had lost his head by a sharp axe, handled by a skilled executioner. It was then said that, following the examination of the head, which served every purpose in view, and without examining the body below the neck, it was immediately restored to its situation, the coffin was soldered up again, and the vault closed. But Halford would allegedly steal parts of the remains of the king, and he removed the vertebrae from the king, and he would show this off at dinner parties to his guests. Charles I was a king who would lose his head for being a man who plunged the country into civil war, and he was by all standards a terrible monarch. But his execution was one which scarred a country and a nation, and shocked everyone around the world. But centuries later the king's coffin would be opened, and his remains would be tampered with and disturbed. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, Thank you so much for watching.